What we are witnessing today in the Persian Gulf and across the broader Middle East is not simply a diplomatic impasse between two adversarial states. It is something far more consequential, a civilizational confrontation between an American imperial order that has grown increasingly reckless in its application of military force and a Persian nation that has endured 40 years of sanctions, threats, covert operations, and now open warfare, and has emerged from all of it with a fundamental refusal to capitulate. When Donald Trump declared on Monday that the ceasefire between the United States and Iran is on what he called massive life support, he was not merely venting frustration at a diplomatic setback. He was, whether he understood it or not, announcing to the world that the architecture of American coercive diplomacy, the belief that sufficient military pressure combined with economic strangulation can bend any adversary to Washington's will, is itself on life support. And that is a far more important story than anything being reported in the mainstream Western press today. To understand how we arrived at this extraordinary and genuinely dangerous moment, one must go back not merely to February 28th of this year, when American and Israeli aircraft launched what the Pentagon euphemistically called Operation Epic Fury, but much further, to the accumulated history of American policy toward Iran that stretches across more than 7 decades. The United States overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. It supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the brutal 8-year war against Iran in the 1980s, a war in which chemical weapons were used against Iranian soldiers with full American knowledge and tacit approval. It unilaterally withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, an agreement that international inspectors had certified Iran was fully honoring, and immediately reimposed the most crushing sanctions in modern history. And then, in January of 2020, it assassinated General Qasem Soleimani, one of Iran's most senior and revered military commanders, in a drone strike at Baghdad International Airport. Each of these actions left a scar on the Iranian national consciousness, and each of them informs Tehran's current posture at the negotiating table, a posture that Washington consistently misreads as obstinacy, when in reality it is the product of hard-learned historical experience. The Iranians are not being unreasonable when they demand security guarantees before agreeing to any framework that requires them to make concessions on their nuclear program or their regional posture. They are being entirely rational. They watched Muammar Gaddafi surrender his weapons of mass destruction program in 2003 in exchange for normalized relations with the West, and they watched him be overthrown and killed 8 years later, with NATO aircraft providing air cover for the rebels who dragged him from a drainage pipe and murdered him in the street. They watched Saddam Hussein, who had no weapons of mass destruction, be invaded, captured, and hanged on the basis of intelligence that was fabricated or grotesquely misinterpreted, and they have now experienced firsthand what it means to be engaged in good faith negotiations with the United States while simultaneously being subjected to military strikes, not once, but twice in the space of less than a year. The 12-day war of June 2025, which ended in a ceasefire that Washington promptly violated in spirit if not in letter, was followed by the far more devastating Operation Epic Fury in February 2026, which was launched astonishingly while nuclear negotiations were still formally ongoing. Is it any wonder that Iranian officials speak openly of a cloud of mistrust when it comes to the United States? Is it any wonder that they are seeking ironclad security assurances before they make a single meaningful concession? And yet, Washington appears genuinely baffled by Tehran's reluctance. Trump's national security advisor, Michael Waltz, appeared on American television over the weekend, speaking with the kind of confident incomprehension that has characterized American foreign policy discourse for generations. He spoke of clear red lines and of giving diplomacy every chance before returning to hostilities, apparently without recognizing the profound contradiction embedded in that formulation, that one cannot simultaneously threaten a country with renewed military assault and expect that country to negotiate from a position of goodwill and trust. The American political and media establishment has spent so many decades operating within the comfortable assumption that American power is both legitimate and overwhelming that it has lost the cognitive capacity to understand how the world looks from the perspective of those on the receiving end of that power. This is not a partisan observation. It applies with equal force to Democratic and Republican administrations alike, but it is particularly acute in the current moment when the Trump administration combines genuine strategic recklessness with an almost theatrical contempt for the subtleties of diplomatic engagement. What Iran actually proposed in its counteroffer, transmitted through Pakistan, which has emerged as one of the more important and underappreciated mediating actors in this crisis, was not, by any reasonable standard of international diplomacy, an unreasonable document. Tehran asked for compensation for war damages, which is a standard demand in any post-conflict settlement and which has precedent in numerous international agreements. It asked for recognition of its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, which is legally and geographically complex, but which reflects a genuine Iranian national interest in controlling what happens in its own territorial waters. It asked for the lifting of sanctions and the release of frozen assets, which again are entirely standard demands in any negotiation aimed at ending a state of active military conflict. And it asked for an end to the fighting on all fronts, including in Lebanon, where Israel continues to prosecute a war against Hezbollah that has already killed more than 2,000 people. None of these demands, taken individually, is outside the range of what any serious negotiator would expect to see on the table. The problem, from Washington's perspective, is that taken together, they amount to something that looks uncomfortably like a negotiation between equals, and that is precisely what the American political system, with its deeply ingrained sense of exceptionalism and its reflexive assumption of dominance, finds psychologically intolerable. But this is where the situation becomes far more dangerous than most Western commentators are currently acknowledging. Because what Trump's rejection of Iran's counterproposal has effectively done is to push the two sides further apart at precisely the moment when the global economic consequences of the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz are beginning to be felt with serious severity. Brent crude is now trading at over $105 per barrel. American consumers are paying an average of $4.52 per gallon at the pump, and researchers at Brown University have calculated that the war has already imposed a $37 billion cost on American households, more than $280 per household, in the form of elevated energy prices. The Federal Reserve is watching these numbers with considerable anxiety because energy price spikes of this magnitude, if sustained, have historically been among the most reliable predictors of broader inflationary spirals. And yet the American political conversation about the Iran war remains almost entirely disconnected from these economic realities, focused instead on the theatrical dimension of Trump's Truth Social posts and the daily drama of ceasefire negotiations that seem to go nowhere. What most analysts are still failing to adequately appreciate is the role that China is about to play in this crisis, and the extraordinary complexity of the position in which Beijing finds itself as Trump prepares to travel there for his summit with President Xi Jinping later this week. China is Iran's largest trading partner and has been purchasing Iranian oil throughout the American sanctions regime, providing Tehran with the economic lifeline that has allowed the Iranian state to function despite years of financial pressure. Washington has now imposed a new round of sanctions specifically targeting Iranian oil sales to China, and Trump has made clear that he intends to use the Beijing summit to press Xi to lean on Tehran to accept American demands. But this formulation reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how China perceives its own interests in this situation. Beijing does not want to be seen as doing Washington's bidding in pressuring a country with which it has deep and long-standing economic and strategic ties. It does not want to set a precedent in which it acts as an enforcer of American foreign policy objectives. And it is acutely aware that any settlement of the Iran war that leaves American dominance of the Persian Gulf fully intact and Iran in a weakened and subordinated position would not serve Chinese strategic interests in the medium or long term. And yet China also does not want to see the Strait of Hormuz remain closed indefinitely. Approximately 20% of the world's oil passes through that narrow waterway, and Chinese industry is as dependent on that flow of energy as any other major economy. The Chinese calculation at the Beijing summit will therefore be extraordinarily delicate, appearing to engage constructively with American concerns about Iran without actually delivering the kind of pressure on Tehran that Washington is demanding, while simultaneously working through back channels to encourage a negotiated settlement that preserves Iranian sovereignty and dignity. This is the kind of multi-layered diplomatic chess that Beijing has become quite skilled at playing over the past 2 decades, and it is precisely the kind of nuanced strategic maneuvering that the Trump administration, with its preference for blunt transactional bargaining, is least equipped to navigate successfully. What happens in Beijing this week may well determine whether the Iran ceasefire survives or collapses entirely, and the implications of that outcome extend far beyond the Middle East. There is a dimension of this crisis that has received almost no serious attention in the Western press, and it is in many ways the most consequential dimension of all. When Ali Khamenei was assassinated on February 28th, in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury, the United States and Israel did not merely kill an individual, however powerful and symbolically significant that individual may have been. They decapitated a theological and political system that had governed Iran for nearly half a century, and in doing so, they set in motion a succession crisis whose full implications are only now beginning to manifest themselves in ways that make the already dangerous situation considerably more unpredictable. Mojtaba Khamenei, The late Supreme Leader's son has emerged as his father's successor, but he has not appeared publicly since the war began, and the reports that he has issued new and decisive directives for military operations, without any elaboration of what those directives actually entail, should be read not as a sign of strength, but as a sign of the profound institutional uncertainty that now surrounds the Iranian leadership structure. A supreme leader who cannot appear in public is a supreme leader whose authority is not yet fully consolidated, and a leadership whose authority is not fully consolidated is a leadership that may feel compelled to demonstrate resolve through military action rather than through the patient and careful diplomacy that the current situation so desperately requires. This is the kind of historical parallel that serious students of international relations will immediately recognize. When Yuri Andropov succeeded Leonid Brezhnev as General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party in November 1982, he too was a leader whose physical conditions severely limited his public appearances, and the uncertainty surrounding Soviet leadership intentions during that period contributed significantly to the extraordinarily dangerous atmosphere of 1983, a year that many historians now regard as the closest the Cold War came to turning hot after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The parallel is not perfect, as no historical parallel ever is, but the structural similarity is striking and deeply worrying. When a major power finds itself in a state of active military conflict while simultaneously navigating a leadership succession of uncertain outcome, the risk of miscalculation on both sides increases dramatically. The Iranian military's warning of surprising options, if adversaries make another miscalculation, must be read in this context not as empty bluster but as a genuine signal from an institution that is operating under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty, and that may not be receiving clear and consistent direction from a political leadership that is itself operating under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. The situation in the Strait of Hormuz itself deserves far more careful analysis than it has received. The American naval blockade of Iranian ports and vessels is an act of war under any recognized standard of international law, and the fact that it is being treated in Western media coverage as a routine exercise of American maritime power rather than as the extraordinary and legally dubious action that it actually is, tells us a great deal about how thoroughly the assumptions of American exceptionalism have colonized the discourse of Western journalism. When the United States Navy fired on Iranian-flagged oil tankers attempting to circumvent the blockade, an action reported almost as an aside in the coverage of the broader ceasefire negotiations, it was conducting what in any other context would be described as an act of piracy against the vessels of a sovereign state. The Iranian demand that the United States end what Tehran's foreign ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei called blockade and piracy and release frozen Iranian assets is not, therefore, a maximalist opening gambit in a negotiation. It is a demand that the United States cease actions that are themselves violations of the international legal order that Washington claims to uphold and defend. But what happened next in the diplomatic maneuvering was even more significant than the public statements and Truth Social posts that dominated the headlines. The quiet passage of a Qatari liquefied natural gas tanker through the Strait of Hormuz on Sunday, the first such passage since the war began, was reportedly approved by Iran as a confidence-building gesture toward Qatar and Pakistan, two of the countries playing the most active mediating roles in the current crisis. This small but symbolically important action reveals something crucial about Iranian strategic thinking that the Trump administration's blunt rhetorical responses have completely obscured. Tehran is not simply stonewalling. It is engaging in the careful, incremental signaling that characterizes sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering, testing whether the other side is capable of recognizing and reciprocating gestures of goodwill rather than simply demanding unconditional surrender dressed up in the language of negotiation. The fact that Trump responded to Iran's counterproposal by calling it a piece of garbage and declaring the ceasefire on massive life support suggests that Washington either did not notice this signal or chose to ignore it, and either possibility is equally alarming. Pakistan's role in all of this deserves particular emphasis because it represents one of the more fascinating and underreported diplomatic developments of the entire crisis. Islamabad finds itself in an extraordinarily delicate position, maintaining its long-standing strategic relationship with the United States while simultaneously serving as the primary communication channel between Washington and Tehran, and doing so in a way that preserves its credibility with both sides. Pakistan has historical experience with this kind of intermediary role, having served as the back channel through which Henry Kissinger secretly traveled to Beijing in 1971 to prepare the ground for Nixon's historic opening to China. The comparison is instructive because it reminds us that some of the most consequential diplomatic breakthroughs in modern history have occurred not through formal multilateral frameworks, but through quiet bilateral back channels facilitated by smaller powers with interests in regional stability. Whether Pakistan can play a similarly consequential role in the current crisis remains to be seen, but the fact that Iran chose to transmit its counterproposal through Islamabad, rather than through any of the more obvious international forums, suggests that Tehran regards Pakistan as a genuinely trustworthy interlocutor, and that is itself a diplomatic asset of considerable value that should not be squandered by Washington's rhetorical recklessness. The economic dimensions of this crisis are simultaneously its most immediate and its most politically explosive aspect, and they are being badly mismanaged by an American administration that appears to believe it can indefinitely sustain the domestic political costs of a war that is costing American households hundreds of dollars in elevated energy prices, without those costs eventually translating into serious political consequences. Trump's suggestion on Monday that he wants to suspend the federal gasoline tax, a proposal that would require congressional action and that would provide only marginal relief relative to the scale of the price increases consumers are experiencing, is the kind of gesture that reveals the depth of the political anxiety surrounding the economic impact of the war without actually addressing the underlying cause of that anxiety, which is the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the consequent disruption of global energy markets. The Brown University calculation that American households have collectively absorbed $37 billion in additional energy costs since the war began on February 28 is a number that should be understood in its full political context. It means that the Iran war has, in the space of roughly 10 weeks, imposed on ordinary American families a financial burden comparable in scale to many of the major federal spending programs that are regularly described in Washington as fiscally unsustainable. And unlike those spending programs, this burden produces no domestic infrastructure, no social services, no economic multiplier effect of any kind. It simply disappears into the elevated profits of energy companies and the sovereign wealth funds of oil-producing states. The Israeli dimension of this crisis adds yet another layer of complexity that the American political conversation is almost entirely failing to grapple with honestly. Benjamin Netanyahu's statement on CBS that it is time for Israel to wean itself from American military support, reducing the annual $3.8 billion military aid package to zero, represents either a remarkable act of strategic independence or a remarkably transparent piece of political theater designed to allow Trump to present any eventual reduction in American military involvement in the region as a mutual decision rather than an American retreat. The truth is almost certainly somewhere between these two interpretations, and understanding which elements of Netanyahu's statement are genuine and which are performative requires a level of analytical sophistication that the American cable news environment is structurally incapable of providing. What is clear is that Israel's interests in the resolution of this conflict are not identical to American interests, and that Netanyahu's insistence that the war is not over because there is more work to be done, specifically regarding Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles and its continued support for regional proxies, creates a significant complication for any American diplomatic initiative that does not fully incorporate Israeli security demands, which are themselves far more maximalist than anything Washington has publicly acknowledged. And if you believe that the complexities described thus far represent the full extent of the strategic challenge facing the parties to this conflict, the implications that emerge from the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing this week suggest that we have not yet reached the most dangerous and consequential phase of this crisis. What is at stake in Beijing is not merely the Iran ceasefire, important as that is. What is at stake is the broader question of whether the United States and China can find a basis for managing their competition in the Middle East in a way that prevents the Iran conflict from becoming the trigger for a far larger confrontation between the world's two leading powers. China has deep economic interests in Iranian oil, in the stability of Persian Gulf shipping lanes, and in demonstrating to the global South that it offers an alternative to the American-led international order that does not come with the kind of coercive conditions and military threats that Washington routinely attaches to its relationships. If Trump attempts to use the Beijing summit to pressure Xi into acting as an enforcer of American demands on Iran, essentially asking China to do Washington's diplomatic heavy lifting in exchange for vague promises of trade concessions, he is likely to discover that Chinese patience with American transactionalism has limits that even his considerable talent for bluster cannot overcome. The deeper truth about this moment, the truth that neither the American political establishment nor the Western media ecosystem seems capable of confronting directly, is that the Iran war represents the most serious test of the American-led international order since the end of the Cold War, and that the United States is currently failing that test in ways that will have consequences extending far beyond the immediate crisis. Every time Trump calls Iran's diplomatic communications garbage or totally unacceptable, he is not merely insulting Iranian negotiators. He is signaling to every country in the world that is watching this crisis, and every country in the world is watching this crisis, that American diplomacy operates according to a simple and brutal logic: accept our terms or face our bombs. That signal is being received with great clarity in Beijing, in Moscow, in New Delhi, in Ankara, in Riyadh, and in every other capital where leaders are quietly recalculating their own strategic positions in light of what the Iran war has revealed about American intentions and American limitations. The ceasefire may indeed be on life support, as Trump has declared, but it is not only the ceasefire that is struggling to survive. It is the entire architecture of American global leadership, and the implications of that larger crisis are only beginning to come into view.